So by now, I'd wager anyone watching this saw the debate in question. Two semi-well-respected public intellectuals debating the meaning of truth for over 2 hours, and making about as much progress as one of Zeno's hairs. Much confusion ensued between the two, and I'm hoping in all of you, because I'm about to try and clear it up. I think the question most viewers will have is, does Peterson know something Sam doesn't? Something which makes his apparently crazy view more palatable than Sam's caricature of it. That's what we'll be trying to figure out today. I know I'm very late to this particular game, but I've had a look at some of the other analyses on offer, and although some were good, not this one, I don't think everything of interest has been said. Far from it. And besides, Harris always welcomes informative discussion of his conversations. Finally, they've just had another debate or two, or so I'm told, which may or may not touch on these issues directly, but given how fundamental the disagreement is, it's likely to manifest in some way or other. If you couldn't force yourself through the entire thing, allow me to sum it up for you. Peterson approaches Harris with a strange notion of truth. Harris proceeds to produce counterexamples, one after another, while Peterson waves vaguely at philosophers who may or may not agree with him. Now, much of this episode is devoted to criticism of Peterson, so in the interest of fairness, I'll spend some time at the end pointing out errors Sam made. Well, let's get started then. What we've got is a debate over the notion of truth. Harris takes the realist position, and Peterson the anti-realist, or pragmatic view. Realists typically claim there is a matter of fact about what is and isn't true, independently of what anyone thinks about it. Anti-realists, on the other hand, have to show that the realist notion of truth can't escape from problems which make it untenable, or would reduce it to an anti-realist one. You could appeal to various kinds of skepticism, attack the objectivity of reason, for example by arguing reason is interest-driven. Peterson actually attempts the latter, but the conversation never strays too far from Peterson's notion of truth. So it's not terribly successful. In general, to defeat an anti-realist, we have to show how our truth claims can be made sense of without succumbing to the anti-realist challenges. Well, that's much more difficult than what Harris has to argue with Peterson. So if you came away from this thinking, why would anyone ever be an anti-realist? Trust me, there's far better representatives of the view than Jordan Peterson. In fact, I'd rate Peterson worse than most college undergrads. To that end, I'll conclude with what I think a good pragmatist would say in Peterson's position. I'll introduce Harris's definition of truth first. It will make for a useful comparison, since it's generally the intuitive view people have. That is, if you ask people what is truth, most will answer, maybe after a minute or two, truth is correspondence to reality. We'll refer to this as the correspondence view hereafter. The intuition is that true beliefs, statements, or propositions are those which accurately represent reality. Truth, then, is a relation of correspondence or representation between statements and the world, or facts, or states of affairs. Now, here's our definition then. The sentence "Snow is white" is true if and only if the sentence "Snow is white" corresponds to reality. Like any philosophical view, this one has its problems, but Harris's presentation of it is standard enough to fit nicely into the existing literature. He isn't making any crazy twists on the view, and so for anyone interested in the objections, I refer you to the Stanford entry. With Peterson, on the other hand, it's debatable. Maybe he is just presenting a pragmatic position with a strange use of Darwinism as an analogy. On the other hand, he could be espousing a distinct form of pragmatism rooted in Darwinism. If Peterson's view reduces to pragmatism, then the question of its superiority to the correspondence view is a genuine one, and of course one with a large amount of literature already devoted to it, so again, go here for that. Which leaves us the task of trying to make sense of Peterson's view as a distinct entity. Fun times ahead. One way of treating Peterson's view of truth, which I'll be abbreviating as P-truth from here on, is actually analogous to Sam's, but replacing the word correspondence with the word adaptation. Truth then could be defined as a relation of being adaptive between organisms and their environment. Ordinarily speaking, Truth is what helps the organism survive its surroundings. In one sense, this is obviously correct. If our senses were not at all adapted to our environment, we would presumably have great difficulty navigating it. Take people tripping on various substances or suffering from sensory deficits as examples. Blind people often need dogs to fill the gaps left by their impairment, keeping them adaptive, as do people with glasses, albeit to a lesser extent. Peterson's claim then is, whatever we think is true, it will have to keep us alive within our environment, or we won't be able to think at all. Truth, therefore, will have to track skills needed to survive a particular environment, and that's apparently the Darwinian notion of truth. Before critiquing the Darwinian view, and by God we will, let's consider some of the implications it has for truth, as Peterson understands it. Because, as I said, I think some of these implications can be reached by far better accounts than the Darwinian one. First, if we take Peterson's claims throughout the debate at face value, it's apparently an anti-realist view. Second, it's also a distinctly moral theory of truth, in that it makes truth the result of a normative creature's normative choices. This is actually another quite large point of disagreement between the two. Harris actually halts Peterson from talking about morality on several occasions because he thinks it's essential to get the notion of truth settled first. While I'll grant that this is usually sensible, I mean, if two people can't agree on the meaning of the word truth, debating any topic other than that seems rather difficult. Truth and morality have also been sharply divided historically. However, Harris and Peterson are actually rather unique in that regard. Both are moral realists. They both believe moral truths exist. But Peterson believes that truth is fundamentally moral, where Harris believes moral truths are fundamentally empirical. So while usually blocking a conversation for this reason is probably efficient, here it prevents Peterson from fully explicating his notion of truth. Alright, let's get to the critiques of P-truth. I won't rehash any of Sam's examples. They all drive towards the same point anyway, which can be made rather simply. Beliefs can be adaptive without being true. Moreover, true beliefs can be maladaptive. Each of Sam's examples highlights cases where Darwinian truth diverges radically from our expectations for the word truth. And this implies whatever overlap adaptation and truth have is accidental rather than essential. To reiterate, I have no problem with Sam's examples, they do their job nicely. But I also have some nice examples, which I think hit a little closer to Peterson's home, that being evolution and morality. So, as an example of the first, let's look at Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, very briefly anyway. We talk about the particular adaptiveness of a behaviour in response to a threat, for example, running from a tiger. There may yet be wide scope for disagreement. Suppose two people see this tiger. One thinks, tigers are dangerous, better run. The other thinks, a tiger, that signifies the start of a race between me and the tiger. And you can make these as absurd as you like. So long as a suitably appropriate behaviour occurs, it doesn't actually matter what the belief that generated it was, or whether it was true or false. Natural selection alone doesn't guarantee true beliefs, only beliefs which would aid survival. And, as we've just seen, those beliefs can be false and yet still adaptive. Plantinga actually thinks this argument makes it quite unlikely that we'd develop reliable sensory faculties on naturalism itself, and as an argument, therefore, for God. And that's itself, of course, debatable and a topic maybe for another day. But you can see here the point Alvin is trying to make is that evolution alone doesn't really guarantee the reliability of our sensory or cognitive faculties. It could only ever do so approximately. Right, for an example of the second, cast your attention momentarily towards morality. A popular modern claim is that moral behaviour and our associated intuitions towards moral realism are most likely the result of the adaptivity of prosociality. Tribes behaving like moral realists won't, within reason, kill and maim each other off for fun, and are thus more likely to survive than ones that do. Almost trivially so. So we have this nice deflationary explanation of moral intuition and behaviour. But the moral realist will retort, so what? The fact that some belief was favoured by evolution has no bearing on its truth. Moral realism could be true or false, and adaptive or non-adaptive, but these need not correlate in any significant way. Presumably it's a contingent fact about us, if fact at all, that moral realism is adaptive. Assuming moral realism is true, and entails much of what we usually take it to, Nazi Germany would not be a particularly adaptive place for open moral realists. Actually, if we assume moral realism is true, this would be an example of a maladaptive true belief. We can also be reasonably confident that there are several species which have evolved with no major selection pressure for or against moral realism. And moreover, there could be selection pressures for and against moral realism, regardless of whether or not moral realism is actually true. Essentially, Darwinian truth floats just as free of moral truth as it does scientific truth. And this is doubly problematic because Peterson wants to say he's describing moral truth. Remember, something he and Harris have in common is a commitment to moral truths. While Harris reduces them to scientific truths, Peterson takes the other direction, attempting a reduction of scientific truth to moral truth. But if our challenge stands, then Peterson can no more claim to reduce moral truth to Darwinian truth than he can scientific truth. And if the reduction of scientific truth was, as you'd expect, to come from morality, then he's doubly screwed. On several occasions, Peterson claims Harris is merely talking about one type of truth, or a microcosm. The implication being that they're speaking on different levels, and hence past each other. It reminded me of something Wittgenstein once said. He was talking about theories of meaning, and there was this super mainstream view called the referential theory, and it just seemed super obvious to everyone. Wittgenstein disagreed with the view, but not its obviousness. Basically, he claimed it was part of meaning in certain languages, and we could even imagine it as the whole of a hypothetical language. But it isn't essential, nor is it the only basis of any good theory of meaning. It's one way of cashing out meaning, a way most people find sensible, but by no means the only correct way. If we treat Peterson's objection to Harris in the same way, we could say scientific truth is perhaps intuitively central to most people's worldviews, but it is only one kind of truth. There's no need to make it the be-all, end-all of every worldview. And you can see this in the comments where he claims humans have done just fine before the development of science itself. The idea is that although scientific truth might seem like the most important type of knowledge, like the referential theory of meaning, is just one part of the larger beast, which is truth. There's no particular reason to prioritize or lay worship at its feet rather than any other. And if we take this line, we could accuse Harris of falling prey to the metaphysical urge and begging the realist's question. Sure, the scientific way of speaking is expedient and perhaps even indispensable, but insisting it's the only one true way to describe the world sounds like an expression of dogmatic faith in one's own view rather than something a scientist would say. But there's a couple of issues with Peterson attempting this sort of strategy. That's because, unlike a good pragmatist, he wants to assign a central role to his own strange notion of truth, while still having the functional notion of scientific truth on the other hand. But, as Harris points out, there's a conflict between these two notions, and if Peterson wants his own to trump scientific truth, then he's committed to all the crazy examples Harris hits him with. Basically, if he says science trumps his own view, he's just agreeing with Harris. And if he says the opposite, he gets reality severely wrong. The right option here is the Wittgensteinian one, of not affording any mode of speaking a privileged position. If he's not taking that option, Peterson is no more anti-realist than Sam, because he places Darwinian truth at the centre of his worldview as a crown metaphysical jewel. Now, you might think that he is for tying truth to facts about us as normative organisms, but that's irrelevant to the metaphysics. The other issue is, if Peterson tries to defend his view along these lines, by claiming all truths are moral truths, science is just another human value system one can choose to pursue, that would put him pretty close to the postmoderns he finds so objectionable. Suffice it to say that the Darwinian portion of Peterson's theory is a gangrenous limb in desperate need of amputation. Well, how about the moral component? Remember, the idea that truth is normative, that is, having to do with the wants and desires of an evolved creature, has views gained in popularity recently, primarily due to the wonderful work of Hilary Putnam. Putnam attacked the sensibility of rigidly distinguishing facts from values from a moderate holism about knowledge. If all knowledge is of one kind, differing only in degree, there's no sense wholly distinguishing the moral from the true. Most people believe themselves to be in possession of at least some moral knowledge, and the sciences seem to require normativity as much as they do mathematics. And we might then plausibly suppose that some moral claims are true, and some true claims are moral. Now, apart from the holism, this isn't actually Putnam's view, by the way. Read the Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy for his view. What I am saying is, Peterson's not in the cold on this one. However, he does seem to make the stronger claim that all truth is moral truth. which is a much bigger pill, bordering on suppository.
Not expecting this to be particularly pleasant. And then once it's in, I guess all you can do is lie back and think of England.
It's basically the difference between saying some moral claims are true on the one hand and claiming all truths are moral on the other. It's worth noting that by the second conversation, Peterson seems to have retreated from this far stronger view, trying only to defend the view that works of fiction can contain useful, true information. Can we defend the claim that truth is inseparable from the human organism? The truths we seek are, after all, only those that serve to further our interests in some perceivable way. Someone told the philosophers. For instance, there isn't a science of the typical features of people called Bob, nor, to my knowledge, is there a hermeneutics of Alex Jones, no matter how hard I wish for it.
Oh, Travis, you gotta come help me, man. Alex is freaking out.
Presumably, this is for the very good reason that no one but me cares. And ultimately, when it comes down to the things that will or won't be known by us, our interests are steering the ship. So it seems, in purely pragmatic terms, our interests do determine what we consider true. Almost trivially, because most truths are discovered by those with a great interest in figuring them out. And this is a point echoed by the early pragmatists, and it's surely true. It's a true claim about truth. It's also surely not a claim about what truth is. That is, unless you be satisfied with a definition like, truth is that which I'd like to know. So the realist can grant that our interests will, in some sense, determine what truths we discover, without having to imply that they determine what truths there are to discover. For example, let's say you really want to deny the greenhouse theory. All the interest and internet browsing in the world isn't going to magically produce good evidence for that claim. You might think there's good evidence if you're not particularly prudent, but your interests don't conjure material evidence, no matter how interested you are. And the evidence so strongly favours its truth that you will not be able to ignore it for long, if you're sensible, of course. But the sad reality is that there are many deniers of climate change, the Holocaust, and the 9/11 conspiracy. And these claims are often embedded in worldviews which support them. Most reasonable people would relent to the greenhouse theory once they've seen enough scientific papers. Not so if you happen to believe in shadow governments. Then you have another option. You're already expecting shady behaviour in every institutional nook. What if the scientists are in on it?
Get away from me, racist! She's God! He's on loose! He's on loose! Never stop me! Racist!
Basically, the pragmatist will push on this idea that there is no theory-free observation. Though we'd like to imagine ourselves better off, and we can reasonably suppose ourselves to be, there isn't anything preventing us from being similarly gullible in ways yet unknown to us. Such was the state of affairs for anyone who thought Newton got physics right. I'll conclude as promised by telling you how a good pragmatist would respond to Harris-like counterexamples. That is, if truth is what's useful, then how do you avoid believing useful falsities? Russell famously decried pragmatism along these lines, asking James why he didn't believe in fictional characters if it would bring him sufficient joy. James's answer was that the most useful knowledge available to us is that of our senses, that on which empirical science presumably rests. Basically, James puts the very truths that Harris and Russell would love to use to Jimmy counterexamples at the very centre of his pragmatism, and it fits quite nicely. So, although it might bring me great personal joy to believe in Bigfoot, there's all this other evidence coming from sources I otherwise find indispensable that tells me I shouldn't. So all the refutations Harris offers against Peterson would fall flat on James, because his definition counts empirical truths among the most useful. If you have a situation where all the empirical facts underdetermine the truth of things, then you can maybe look at what's most useful to believe. Some controversial examples are morality, free will, whether or not a God exists, and inductive skepticism. I find that last one particularly interesting. Probably all the scientific types listening to the first three were shaking their heads in disgust at such a cavalier attitude. You believe in free will for such a petty reason? But I bet you have about as good a case against the problem of induction as libertarians do for their view. Don't forget, your willingness to suspend worrying about various skeptical issues is itself an irrational prejudice. This is also, I think, a more serious illustration of the role our interests play in discovering truth. It can be far more insidious than the conspiracy example. But whatever you think about the finer points of James's pragmatism, it isn't inconsistent with the kind of scientific truth in Harris's examples. And this leads to a fairly obvious question. Why doesn't Peterson just take James's view, or one like it, rather than messing around with Darwinism? And my best armchair guess is Darwinian truth allows him to claim the most true things will be the ones most useful for survival. More specifically, the ones most adaptive throughout our history. And he can then claim Judeo-Christian values have the best track record, explaining all the history he cares about to the present day. If any of you have actually read his books, let me know how bad my telepathy is. But that would make our capital T truths not those of everyday experience, but those which have stood the test of time under various environmental variations. This might have something to do with Peterson's claims that Harris is focusing on micro-truths while he's looking at the big picture. At least that's the only reason I can fathom why he'd be so hell-bent on this particular view, at any rate. But even if it weren't wrought with terminal difficulties, it wouldn't actually do what Peterson wants, assuming this is what he wants it for. For why not believe Platonic metaphysics are the true spring from which all else flows? Why not prefer the more primal truths which kept our ancestors alive for far longer than a meagre 2,000 years? Why not look into the truths of bacteria? They do pretty well too, you know, and so forth. Another looming issue is actually that most evolutionary psychologists think our evolved heritage comes from way further back than Peterson. This is a plausible assumption given our understanding of how evolution works. Now, Peterson mentions this disagreement in the second debate, and maybe he has some argument as to why he's right and the rest of the evolutionary psychologists are wrong. Basically, Petersonian truth was not very adaptive. Now it's dead. And after watching this, if not the debate itself, I hope anyone attempting to spread this abortive idea will reconsider. One way or another, Peterson's gotta drop the Darwinian truth stuff. It just makes no sense. He can still believe that moral and scientific truth overlap if he takes the Putnam-style holism on board. Arguing that all truth is moral would be a good bit more difficult, but maybe it's not impossible. He can even keep his anti-realism if he's willing to go one of the two ways discussed above. One is the pragmatic view, a couple of which I've loosely outlined here. The other is a Nietzschean path, which Peterson alludes to but never expounds on. Next time I'm going to explore this Nietzschean option with the issues of this debate in mind. And in much the same way, we'll see Peterson can adopt the view, but not without compromising his own goals. So it seems Peterson's views are mostly salvageable by reduction to other philosophical positions. However, these reductions come at the cost of claims Peterson seems to value quite highly. I think this moral is borne out by the second discussion with Harris, where Peterson's contentions are far more modest.